All right, let's get started. We'll let people trickle in as they do. Today's topic for the webinar is just a quick update on testing for this upcoming school year. We're going to focus on what we've learned and how we're going to apply that to give everybody the best shot at getting their highest possible score when they need to get it. I am Adam Allouche. I am the Director of Test Prep at ESM. And with me today is Brian Smith, our Director of Curriculum. Hi, Brian.
Adam, look forward to discussing, latest testing updates for everyone.
Yeah, it kind of just feels like the daily conversations we have about all of these things that are just being recorded. We're going to cover a lot today. We're going to cover what we've learned from the past year of really test optional / testing in the age of COVID. Go over what those test optional policies are, give advice for current seniors, sophomores, juniors, catch you up on some news and notes relating to each test. And then most importantly, answer any questions that you have. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to chat us. If we don't get to them, you can email us. You can email me at adam@esmprep.com, and I'll be happy to answer you and answer any questions that you do have. What have we learned in the past year? It's a great question, Brian. I would say the answer is not much. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, pretty much. Like it's, huge changes and all that, but it takes a couple years to really see kind of the full impact of this, especially as COVID is ongoing. So it's hard to say at this point, but there are a few things for sure.
Yeah, so what we're really seeing from the outcomes of last year's admissions cycle is that the historical goal of test optional, which is to increase equity in college admissions, help students that are underrepresented or from lower have socioeconomic backgrounds or a little lower, those are successful. We're seeing a higher percentage of students that caliber get into schools. The give and take there, and especially in the UC system, is that students from higher wealth brackets, more competitive schools are having a little bit more trouble getting into schools, especially public universities. I mean, UC's was a pretty big bloodbath. We've had to recalibrate to a pretty important degree, what schools we recommend for students and their chances at each of those schools. We still don't have a lot of data of how viable going test optional really is. Historically, the college admissions process and the decisions that are made in closed rooms at each school are extremely opaque. We don't know what goes on there. We have a rough idea from former admissions officers, but what gets kids into schools is generally a really subjective thing that we don't get a lot of data on. And that's even more true this year. We don't really know from any given school what percentage of students they took that are test optional, that didn't submit scores, that did, what the breakdown of those kids are by income level, ethnicity. So we're still really in the dark to a certain degree of what really test optional is doing to the admissions process. As a result, you better play it safe, especially now for this year, as testing does look to be more possible nationwide. Juniors and rising seniors should still be planning to take these tests to score as well as they can and to study really hard for them to give them the best chances of admissions across all of their schools on their school list, of course. All right, Brian. So test optional, what really is it?
So we have a couple different policies, a little bit of terminology that is associated with this college app stuff. It's not too much, I promise, but it's just a little bit here. So the main one that everyone's going to want to know is test optional, right? All that means is that students are given the choice of submitting their test score or not. They don't have to, but sort of what that kind of means is that if students are able to take the test and they're happy with their score, you should probably send it. That is usually what kind of optional means. At this current point, most schools in the US are test optional with a few pretty big exceptions. But that is the majority at this point. And I expect that we do expect most schools to kind of stay test optional, right? It's possible a few will revert to test required and test fine. I'll talk about those in a second. But a lot of schools are already kind of trending test optional pre-COVID, and there's going to have to be significant data evidence for them to kind of move in a different direction. So we expect that this is here to stay. So it's about 2/3 of schools are test optional right now. So the other one's test blind. This is pretty simple. This means that students cannot submit scores to these schools. The big example of test blind schools would be here in California. We have the UCs and CSUs. Those are both fully test blind, meaning students cannot submit scores to those schools. There are other test blind schools in the US, but those are the big examples, and there's still not too many of them. Most schools are test optional. Even fewer at this point are test required schools, right? This is the old status quo that the school requires students to submit test scores. There are really not very many of them at this point. Mostly a few kind of schools in Georgia and Florida, I think, for the most part, and that's like pretty much it for the most part.
Yeah, military academies is another one. So what is the effect? And we talked about this a little bit on the previous slide, but we saw some astronomical application numbers for early decision, early action, and regular decision last year. And we're expecting that same increase this year. It's really the real reason that test optional is here to stay. When you get test optional, students that think that testing is the only thing holding them back from getting into a great school are going to say, oh, okay, well, what's $75? What's $90 if I can have a real shot now at that school? So we're seeing astronomical numbers in terms of application, which is leading to millions of extra dollars in application revenue for schools. So if you just had to make one small change to your admissions process and you were guaranteed, some schools are making millions, $10 million if you're getting 50,000 applicants, it's just going to be here to stay. It makes you look more selective. It self-selects who actually does submit their scores. So when you look at those US and News World reports, you look at admissions websites, they're going to say, oh, our incoming class of 2025 or 2026 has the highest test scores on average of any of our classes. Well, that's because the kids that got in and didn't submit test scores were probably the ones that were dragging that down in previous years when they did have to submit. So all of this is to say it makes schools more money, it makes them look more selective, and it makes the kids they're submitting look smarter because of these higher quote unquote test scores that they're submitting on their website. Okay, so what's happening with the SAT? There are not a lot of new changes to the SAT this fall. A lot of the major changes happened earlier this year when the SAT got rid of the essay. They got rid of SAT subject tests, which were those subject-based tests. So this fall, we're having a somewhat quote unquote regular SAT cycle, just without the essay. Registration has been open since middle of July. And really the biggest thing to know is that spots fill up so quickly. Based in the Bay Area, we see students, really within the first week, if you didn't sign up, we have students that couldn't get a test anywhere close to where they live, and they couldn't get a test really up till December. So we're seeing students that, if you're signing up now for a test in the fall, if you live in the Bay Area, Northern California, and other places, it's really hard to find spots. So that's why we were so adamant that everyone sign up early to reserve spots if you knew you were testing somewhere in the fall, just to make sure you had a spot that's convenient to test. And Brian, we've seen the effects of having to drive 2.5 hours, 3 hours to take these tests. If you don't stay the night before, that means you're waking up at 5 a.m. and you tend not to do your best when you're in the car for 3 hours before another 3-hour test, or really a 4 or 5 hour experience with the SAT. In terms of test centers, we did see an increase in the number of test centers across the country this year, but there are fewer seats per center, which means that the demand is ultimately still outpacing supply. As you all can probably expect, the reason we have fewer seats is still because COVID is a legitimate risk at all these schools. So they played it safe by trying to get more schools involved as national test centers, but limiting the amount of seats per classroom as a public health precaution. As of today, we look to be in business, really. There's not a lot of cancellations for the August 28th test, which is coming up in 10 days. The only real cancellations, I think Sacramento might actually be the biggest city in the country that has a cancellation. It's only one of the test centers in Sacramento. A lot of them are just spread out among the country of places that have just become, increasingly hit hard in a really localized setting. So most of the test centers in major metropolitan areas of the US are still on for August. And that's also true in the UK and Europe, where we don't really have any canceled test centers as of right now. most of the test centers globally that are canceled are in the Middle East and in Asia.
And
All right,
we
Brian,
don't
what's
know
happened
for
with the
sure.
ACT?
Well, pretty similar stuff, like for the most part, in terms of the cancellation and COVID stuff. But the September ACT is a little farther away than the August SAT, so we're not totally sure of cancellations yet. In fact, ACT hasn't even posted their official cancellation list for September yet. It still says July. I'm sure they will update that soon. I'm starting to
I'll tell you
hear-
exactly when they're going to update that, Brian. They're going to update that the minute the late registration deadline closes, which is this
Right,
Friday.
which is Friday. Yeah, okay, great. So check that on Friday, and that's when we'll start kind of hearing about it. But I am hearing it a little bit here and there. So here, basically, otherwise, there's not like any kind of huge news. It's pretty similar to the SAT. We already kind of know how everything is going. So last year they did these sort of like pop-up sites where ACT hosted like certain locations where students could test that were basically hosted by SAT. For example, like the Hyatt Regency at SFO Airport was a pretty big one. As of right now, it doesn't seem like they're doing those again. We'll see. We haven't really heard anything, but it doesn't really seem like it. I imagine they would only really do it again if the COVID situation really gets worse, which who knows. Other than that, what is new is that they finally have a fully integrated super scoring into their website. And so basically what super scoring is it allows you to combine your highest individual scores from certain sections. This has always existed, but now ACT has sort of like fully like embraced it on their website, and they will now basically do the super scoring for you, which they didn't do before. And they will now allow you to send a super score to colleges directly for that. And last and definitely least, we have just kind of found out that there might be one really small change to the ACT reading section. Basically, they might be adding a few graph questions here and there to the section. Hopefully nothing like kind of significant though. It shouldn't require any different changes or approaches to the section as a whole.
Yeah, we joke about them adding graph questions to the reading section because the SAT copied the ACT when they redesigned to add graph questions to their reading because they didn't have the ACT science. Now the ACT, which still has a science section, which tests that ability, and they're like, oh, we have to copy the people that copied us, and now they're adding something that they already actually have on their test in the science section. So we're not really sure why they did this. But we're going to obviously update everybody as we get more information, as we see how this is actually tested on real tests. The super scoring aspect of things logistically is really amazing because in the past, if you wanted to send, say you got your highest section score across 4 tests, you would have to send every school on your list that you wanted to send scores to, all 4 of those tests individually. So if each one's $13, you're spending $52 on each school to send those 4 tests, and then they would create the super score based on your highest sections. Now you send one report to every school that has your super score at the top and all of this test states that contributed to your test scores to your super score under it. So you get every score in one report that contributes to your super score, and that report's only, I think, $16. It's roughly around there. So not only is it way cheaper, more importantly for me, it's much faster to send student scores than having to do it 4 times instead. I can do it as 1, and it just is a much easier process. So we're very excited about the ACT Super Score report, just from a logistical perspective. Something that's become increasingly popular since in the age of COVID is what's called SAT School Day and ACT District Testing. Those are in-school tests that schools can opt to pay for their students only. So they're pretty similar to the test day experience of the PSAT, which was a national test that students can take in school, usually on a Tuesday, and then they get graded through the College Board. It's kind of the ceremonial start to their SAT process. Now schools can opt to do school day or district testing for a certain subset of their schools, of their students. So if you have a student maybe at Sacred Heart in Atherton or Menlo School, I know that they've done tests in this October. They're going to do an SAT and an ACT for their seniors. So what it does is it gives seniors an extra opportunity. Maybe they weren't able to test in the spring because of COVID. Gives them an extra opportunity where the school themselves controls the logistics around it. They can create a safe environment. And we found that it's a really great opportunity for our kids to test well. They're testing in a familiar environment with people they know, with proctors they know, and it's a pretty streamlined, pretty efficient process. So these tests are pretty popular now, more than they have been they're still not that accessible in public schools. We see a lot of private schools doing this, not as many public schools. But when you're done, you get an official ACT or SAT score. Those are scores just like you would take on a Saturday at a national test center that can be sent to colleges for consideration as part of your application. All right, so some advice for the class of 22 and beyond. Like we said before, test optional is here to stay, but you should still plan to test and test well. So if you're a junior right now that's thinking, oh, all these schools are test optional, I'm not even going to bother with this year, I would strongly reconsider, because if you're at a very competitive school in a competitive area, and the people that you're competing with for admission in your own school or at schools like yours in that area are submitting high test scores, and everything else is the same, but they have a high test score, we're willing to bet that that student is going to get in, all else equal. There are some exceptions to that we're happy to talk on an individual basis, but you should be planning to test and test well. Some things to do just to make sure is checking the testing requirements on all the official admissions websites. Don't rely on third-party materials. They tend to not be as updated as admissions websites, and checking percentile ranges on their websites. Tools like Navion's score. Those can tell you where your score kind of fits in the grand scheme of things. We always recommend trying to be at that 75th percentile that a lot of schools post on their website. That shows that you're, in the top 25% of applicants or of students that were admitted last year is really what they show you. Other ways you can use tools like Navient and Score, and this is another thing that you can use your school counselors for, is to ask about certain outcomes from last year's class from your school. So if you're interested in going to Brown and applying early decision, ask your school counselor, hey, did you have any students that applied to Brown early last year? And what was their GPA? Did they submit a test score? Did they get in, get deferred? So that's some really good data that you can get from your school counselors, and they also do track those outcomes in Navient and Score. But be wary about some other aspects of advice from your school counselor. Brian and I have heard so many horror stories from students coming to us sobbing, saying, my school counselor told me if I don't get a 1500 on the SAT, I shouldn't even bother submitting a score. That's just very harmful advice for us. I had a student, junior girl, that told me that crying, and for somebody that has self-esteem issues already or test confidence issues, like that can be debilitating advice. So always run what your school counselor says through your parents, through an ESM mentor or counselor, so we can kind of tell you whether it's something worth considering or not. A lot of the times with testing, they tell you things that either makes their job easier or is just a blanket statement to just kind of get you out of their office. But you always have to be nice to them. Even if they tell you something that horrible, I've heard even worse, you still have to sit there with a smile, because those people have more power over the admissions process than ever in the age of COVID, especially when schools weren't in person last year. They are the ones that have a required recommendation for every student through the Common App. They are the ones that are going to kind of prioritize. If they have 4 kids that are applying to the same school early, they're going to have a list that they're going to give to school. So even if you get bad advice, or you think you get bad advice, or they offend you, it's an unfortunate reality that you kind of have to grin and bear it through this process, so that they you still have favor in their eyes when you're applying to schools. And then parents, resist the gossip chain. This is more important now than ever, when we get kind of anecdotal evidence of, oh, I heard of my friend's kid who got into Princeton without submitting a score. You don't ever know the whole picture there. So, that those like very small sample anecdotes can really lead parents astray. So talk to us about it. We're happy to give you all the outcomes that we've seen in the past year for students that did submit scores, didn't submit scores, but the one-offs can be really hurtful, can lead you astray if you follow them too closely. All right, Brian, what are you telling our seniors only?
Well, I mean, it's pretty simple advice at this point. Like, if you're still taking tests, like, make sure study is hard. Take whatever time you have available right now. Right now, that school is just getting started. You're not too overwhelmed yet. You will be. So make sure you study as hard as you can right now. That's definitely the main thing. Take these tests if you're all available. You don't have too much time left, right? And for a lot of these schools, they won't accept dates past even like October or November sometimes. So you need to really do the best you possibly can on these August, September, and October ones. And also just, get them out of the way, quote unquote, as soon as possible, so you can focus on school, sports, college apps, and all that, other billions of things you need to do. And so the second part of this is, if you have not registered, make sure you do that right now. Like literally, you should stop watching this and go register right now. It might already be too late for some of these kind of like really recent ones. And it's just, especially during this COVID time, it is a nightmare to register, and you just want to have it taken ahead of time as soon as you possibly can, just to get spots close to you and just make sure, well, that you're ready. Right? I would even register for a test that you don't think you'll need to take, just in case. Right? If you think that you'll be done with December ACT, great. I'd still register for October or December, just in case, so you have it as a backup. Definitely doesn't hurt, for sure. Same thing for school tests. I mean, this one is much easier, right? Your school should send you an email, or they should let you know if they're hosting these tests. Again, just take advantage of the opportunity. Like I would say, even if you're studying for ACT and they have an SC school day, just take it. Why not? Right? It doesn't hurt you at all. It's free, right? Just take it. It's an opportunity. Who knows? Other than that, now it's time, if you have scores or you kind of can project where your score is, it's now really time to start filtering down that college list, right? Check testing requirements for each school, see if they're optional, see if they're blind, check their score ranges, right? Make sure you kind of fit in the profile for that school, right? And then, of course, now this is about a month or so down the line, start submitting scores as required for each school, right? Make sure you do that. Again, something you just kind of want to get out of the way as soon as possible. Obviously, you don't want to skip that step. That would really suck.
Yeah, let's go into a little bit more about registration and kind of timelines for tests. If you are applying early decision or early action, so those are generally a November 1st or a November 15th deadline, the majority of schools just accept October tests. So the last test that you could submit would be the October 2nd SAT, and the late October ACT. Now you should check that on every school. Schools will tell you, hey, the last one we accept for early is the October test. Some schools might allow you to submit the November 6th SAT, for example, if maybe you're a November 15th application. So you should check that to make sure what the last score that you can submit or the last test you can take that's going to be considered for early. You should do the same thing for regular, honestly, but almost, I would say 100% of schools at this point, it's December, right? Because there's no January test. Yeah. So that's really always the last one, is those first 2 Saturdays of September for the SAT and ACT, respectively. If you are not registered for tests or you're registered far away, there are glimmers of hope to get better test centers. It really involves religiously checking the College Board website and just hoping that maybe somebody changed their test registration away from a place that you want, and there might be one spot available. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up that it's going to work for sure, but it does work if you get lucky. I've gotten, every person that I've had to help with that over the last year or so, if you check every day or multiple times every day, you're kind of making your own luck, so to speak. So register for a test that you can get to, right? Register for that test that is 3 hours away. That's kind of a pain that would require maybe staying there the night before, but constantly check. And there are great times to check that where you might have an increase in test changes. So for example, if you're signed up for the October SAT or ACT, you should be checking the website the day that August scores get released and that September scores get released for the ACT. Because in theory, you have students that maybe get the score that they want and they're done and they can say, okay, I'm going to cancel my registration, which is actually much harder to do on the ACT than the SAT. And so you might be able to grab their spot because they're going to be done testing. So check when score release days are out or the days like immediately after score releases to try and grab a spot closer, because it is a little bit of a fluid situation.
And to add on to that, one more ACT tip specifically, if you're registered for ACT without essay, without the writing section, you can also try adding with writing. And often we've kind of found locations that are closer just because everyone knows the essay section is kind of irrelevant. So people are signing up for tests without essay. So that does kind of mean that there are more spots like with the essay. Not a whole lot more, but it depends on your location, but it's worth a shot. And you can always just drop the essay later on the day of the test. I think that usually works for most students. But
yeah, you can drop it on the day of the test. Sometimes they might not have spots without the essay, but also I would rather a student take a 40-minute essay that's not too hard than have to drive another 2 hours. It's definitely worth that. Parents, you might have to fight that battle. Had some pushback on kids that really don't want to take that essay, but it does make for a higher score generally if you have a much more convenient test center.
Absolutely.
Juniors, take an ACT and SAT diagnostic as soon as possible if you have not already, because spots are so limited. If you're a kid that maybe is a really great test taker and you're like, okay, I'm just going to knock this out by December, but you haven't really used the summer to get ahead or to take a diagnostic, you need to do so now so that you can actually see if you're going to be ready for a test in this first semester and sign up immediately, because as we've said, for seniors, spots are extremely limited. If you are a junior right now that hasn't taken a diagnostic, just to set expectations, I think it's most likely that you are going to test in the spring. It is going to be very hard for you to test in the fall if you haven't already registered for a spot. So that would mean you're really taking the February ACT maybe as your first one. Maybe you can sneak a December test. That's semi-convenient, but most likely it's February ACT and March SAT. So still take a diagnostic now, because this stuff creeps up fast. You know, we would generally recommend at least a couple months, 2 to 3 months of prep before your first test. And if you're able to do that now when school is just getting started, maybe you don't play a fall sport and you have time, there are reasons to get started right away, just in how much you have on your plate, and to try and spread that out, you know, as best as possible. If possible, try to finish testing by June and July to really preserve next year's summer for applications and essays, so that you don't have a lot on your plate. We don't want fall testing. Fall testing is something we try to avoid at all costs for seniors, because that means you have to test, which is still a big deal in admissions. You have to do all your applications. You still have to do great grades, because senior year, spring, besides junior year, those are the most important grades that colleges look at. That's a lot on your plate on top of, you know, sports and extracurriculars. So we really try to make sure that we get students signed up for that. You know, if it's the ACT, it's February through June. So February, April, June, and July as a backup, and then March, May, June for the SAT.
And it's also just like, it's a variable that's been controlled already. You already have your score. You know, like kind of where you're at in terms of what schools are looking for. Right? If you don't have that as a senior right now, it causes a lot of extra anxiety. You probably have to expand like your college list because you're not really sure what you're going to get. And just avoid fall testing at all possible. And so tests for the spring tests are already, registration is already open all the way through June. So yes, even for you juniors, register right now. And again, even if you're not sure you're going to take the test, I'd still register for as many as you possibly can. The longer you wait, the more spots are going to fill up, right? So the spring ones are generally pretty open right now, but by January, it's not going to be so open.
Yeah, it's a great point about clarity for kind of your school list. And the parents, if you need an ace in the hole for the argument of getting your kids to start this early, if you get a great score early on, that means that you probably can submit your, you know, kind of prune that list to not have as many safety schools. The list tends to dwindle as you know what your score is and as you know what your GPA is going to end up at. So what you can tell your kids is, okay, if you get this score and maybe you have 20 schools on your list right now, we can get that to maybe 12, 13, and that's 7 fewer schools where you have to write supplemental essays. You can get into math there and say, okay, if each school requires 500 words of total supplements, that's 3,500 words you just saved. That's a lot of time over the summer. So you can really appeal to your kids on an analytical, mathematical basis there.
Yeah, the
for sophomores. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, like the 12th YS essay, like, you know, really starts to get the kids once you get to.
Yeah, why do you want to go to this school? It gets pretty monotonous after a while. So for sophomores, if you're planning to play sports in college, we do recommend that you try to take a test in this late spring of your sophomore year. For a lot of sports now, you can't really start talking to coaches until September 1st of your junior year. So if you already have a pretty competitive score, it doesn't have to be your final score, but it's an official score. Maybe you're pretty close to the benchmarks that coaches want to see. That can give you a real leg up in initial conversations with coaches, because they can say, okay, you've already met the grade. Your test score is going to be where I want it to be. I feel very confident from the academic index side of things that you are qualified to, for admission to this school. And now I just have to make sure that, you're the right player for our program. So we do recommend trying to get at least one test. That's kind of the June SAT or the June and July ACT, just to go into the recruiting process, the official recruitment process with that known quantity. If you're not planning to play sports, we generally recommend diagnostic SATs and ACTs at the end of Algebra 2 or after you've completed it. That's more important for the ACT, to be honest, but it's just kind of an easy blanket statement. The SAT doesn't have a ton of Algebra 2, but it has some. So that's generally the kind of signifier that you're ready to take these tests. Of course, if you're a junior in Algebra 2, then you don't have time for that. So that really only applies to sophomores taking Algebra 2. If you're a junior in Algebra 2, you should still take these diagnostics early on. And you probably are going to like the SAT a little bit more just because there's less Algebra 2. And then take challenging courses and start to think about how that's going to affect what you want to do junior year, what you want to do in your summers. But just make sure your grades are high and that you're really challenging yourself with a rigorous course load in school. All right, that's it for update. Go ahead.
Just one quick add for sophomores that you'll also be taking the PSAT, so you can use that to kind of get a good feel for what the SAT looks like. The PSAT is pretty similar. It's a little easier, a little shorter, but it does kind of preserve the whole structure of the SAT, and that's a good way to kind of get a good basic feel for these tests too.
Yeah, those usually happen in October. Some schools a lot of schools are doing them this year when they didn't do them last year because of remote learning. So it is an opportunity to kind of ceremonially start the process. Generally, if you take the October SAT, you get your score sometime in December. Now they've moved up that timeline. So it can work as an SAT diagnostic. Some schools do a pre-ACT. A lot of them don't. So you can take up one of our Saturday proctored Zoom ACTs to get a diagnostic.
Yep.
All right, well, that's it. If you have any questions, again, you can reach out to us via our website, esmprep.com. You can email me directly at adam@esmprep.com. Thank you for coming and best of luck with the test prep process. Thanks again, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.